All right, so as Jared mentioned, my name is Chris Burns. I'm one of the historians at Heritage South Australia. And when the Victa Cinema was nominated in November last year to be assessed for possible state heritage listing, it was my job to dig into the history of the Victa Cinema to determine whether or not it met the criteria for heritage listing. And it did. It met no less than four of the criteria for state heritage listing. But more on that a little bit later on. Tonight's talk will trace the history of the Victa Cinema, beginning with the Griffin family's pioneering cinema screenings in the neighbouring Victor Harbour Institute. It will follow the endurance of the Victa Cinema through a catastrophic fire, competition from rival cinemas, absorption by statewide and later national film exhibition chains, and the looming challenges of television, drive-in theatres, video and the digital era of streaming. And along the way, some of the many characters who have played a role in the Victa Cinema story will be introduced. And also uncovered tonight will be the little known but fairly pivotal role that the Victa Cinema played in the development of modern South Australian architecture. So I'll talk for about an hour and 5 minutes tonight, and afterwards we'll have some time for some questions. So motion pictures were first screened in South Australia from 1897 as a novelty, first of all, but cinema did not emerge as a popular form of mass entertainment until about 1907, so sort of 10 years later. Cinema going boomed during the 1920s, and by the end of the decade, most communities in South Australia possessed a venue for screening motion pictures, ranging from large purpose-built picture theatres in urban centres, like this one, to small country halls retrofitted with projection facilities. Prior to the Second World War, cinemas were usually described as picture theatres or sometimes as picture houses. And the word cinema that we know today was rarely used prior to the 1960s, something that is reflected in the changing names of this place. The first films, of course, had no soundtrack. The stories were predominantly told visually, with the occasional intertitle for dialogue. However, silent films were always accompanied by music, whether from a piano or from an orchestra, and sometimes there were sound effects too, so gunshots, rolling thunder, that sort of thing. This is a photo player. It's kind of like a pianola kind of contraption. This comes from the Goolwa Centenary Hall originally, and it has various sound effects mounted in the in the cabinet on the right. So the presentation of silent films was never actually silent. It's hard to believe today in the age of streaming, but there was a time when the film itself was a physical object. The film was delivered to the theatre in cases, a bit like this one. There's actually one down the front on display you can have a look at later. And the box contained probably at most 2 reels of film. Each one was about 20 minutes long, and a typical feature comprised between 5 and 10 of these reels. Picture theatres usually had 2 projectors. This was so the projectionist could switch between reels without interrupting the film. So here we can see one projector on the left, one on the right, and in the middle is a slide projector for showing advertising slides, and that's sort of that one there. So one there, and the slide projector. So in the hands of a skilled projectionist, the audience has no idea that one reel has tailed out on the first projector and the second reel has just started rolling on the second projector. It's a totally seamless transition. In the early days, there were no permanent picture theatres. Instead, exhibitors travelled from town to town, quite often following the railway lines, but sometimes by road, and they took their projector, their diesel generator, to power the projector lamp, and their dozens of film cases with them. And they would show films in the local town or institute hall, like this one at Port Elliot. In 1912, a young man named Edgar David Gladstone Griffin toured Kangaroo Island with Gil Pudney's travelling picture show, known as King's Pictures. Edgar was 15 and his job was to play the piano. When they arrived back in Adelaide, Edgar's father, David Henry Griffin, purchased a share in the company, and Ed's brother, George Henry, known as Harry, joined the travelling show as an electrician. A little while later, Dad, David Griffin, bought out Gil Pudney's share. The brothers renamed themselves Griffin's Pictures, And the Griffin brothers, Harry and Edgar, spent the next several years touring the Adelaide Hills, Fleurieu Peninsula and Lower Murray regions. And according to Edgar, Griffin's pictures visited just about every town south of Adelaide. They were quite successful, and by 1917 they had established a reputation for showing clean, up-to-date and interesting pictures. And by this time they were also showing films in the Victor Harbour Town Hall. The Griffin brothers' father, David Griffin, was a public servant, and in the late 1910s he had a breakdown in health. We're not exactly sure what that was, but he had 2 serious operations. In 1918 he resigned from the public service and moved down to Victor Harbour permanently, with his family seeking a better climate. So I guess a bit of a sea change for the Griffin family. Victor Harbour had been a coastal resort since the 19th century, thanks to the rail connection to Adelaide. In the 1920s, improved roads and growing private motor vehicle ownership meant that more and more people were visiting Victor Harbour. In those days, cars were much less reliable than they are today. And so it wasn't long before David Griffin had the idea of building an up-to-date motor garage to service the holiday road traffic coming to Victor Harbour. So he bought a block of land on, oh that's annoying, he bought a block of land on Ocean Street, this block of land. This is Ocean Street as it appeared a few years earlier in about 1912 with the Grosvenor Hotel on the left. And David Griffin built a fine and well-equipped motor garage on this site with accommodation for about 30 cars. So it was quite a big business, really. Meanwhile, David Griffin became quite involved in Victor Harbour as a community leader in various activities, including membership of the Freemasons, the Oddfellows and the Rechabites. And in 1921 he was elected unopposed to the office of Mayor of Victor Harbour, a position he filled for 7 years. By the early 1920s, the Griffins had been screening films in the Victor Harbour Institute for a number of years, but being a public building, they had to share the institute with other community groups, which wasn't the most satisfactory situation. And so in 1923, the Griffin family decided to build a picture theatre, which would be their own exclusive venue, which they called the Victa Theatre. This is the original Victa Theatre drawing of the building, which opened on the 24th of November 1923. Quite different from the Victa Cinema of today. But it was a typical South Australian picture theatre of the early 1920s. These are the original architect's drawings of the Victa Theatre that it was built from, and these are held in the University of South Australia Architecture Museum. They were drawn on drafting linen, which is a special type of linen with a very fine weave that has a wax coating to make a smooth surface suitable for drawing on. This is the front elevation, the front view facing Ocean Street. The main entrance is in the centre and there are shops on either side. The shops would be let out and that would provide the owners with some rental income to supplement their takings from ticket sales, so increasing their profitability. Originally one was a fruit shop and the other was a sweet shop here at the Victa Theatre. You'll notice there are no front doors. And this is because in the silent theatre, in the silent film era, most theatres had a front vestibule or foyer that was open to the street, usually with a pair of steel concertina gates that could be closed across at the end of the night. And one of the reasons was in the silent era, film entering the theatre wasn't considered to be a major problem. The films were silent, audiences were fairly rowdy. The piano or the orchestra accompanying the film was fairly loud, so sound coming in wasn't considered to be the problem that it would be today. Now this is not the, this is really temperamental. There we go, okay, so this is not the Victa Theatre, this is the Princess Theatre at Marriotteville, but, which opened 3 years later, but it's very similar to how the front vestibule of this theatre would have looked in the early 1920s. There's a tiled sloping floor, tiled walls, and a timber ticket box standing in the middle of the floor. This is the Victa Theatre's original ticket box, the architect's drawing for it, and it would have been a hardwood, something like a Queensland maple or a blackwood or something like that. So this is a plan view of the Victa Theatre looking down. We've got the entrance vestibule in the middle on the far right, with shops either side. There's a ladies' toilet. Gents' toilets are outside, out the back. There's a manager's office, and there's an engine room. And the engine room was where there were basically diesel generators to provide electric current to power the light source of the projector lamps. And this was because the light source had to be so bright to project that picture onto the screen. We can also see steps leading up to the projection room, which was located above the vestibule. And behind that sort of front of house area is the auditorium where the audience was seated with a laneway down the side. And then at the far end of the auditorium on the left is the stage and the screen, so in sort of that area there. This is a, oops. Where am I up to? This is a cross-section of the building, that one, showing the stage, the screen, and the proscenium around the screen, which is kind of like a frame around the screen, like a picture frame. This is a long section right down the guts of the building, sort of looking that way. You can see the entrance with the tiled sloping floor, which I mentioned, sort of way up there. You can, with a little projection room up above, up there, and the auditorium with a sloping floor and then a flat floor. The sloping floor had fixed seats, like the ones you're sitting in. The flat floor would have had folding seats that could be cleared out the way, stored under the stage, and then the flat area could be used for dancing or other purposes. The other kind of feature is the windows all the way along. These were for ventilation, and they had a pivot in the centre with a long pulley rope so they could be opened and closed. This is a side view. So the Victa Theatre was built using around 95,000 Port Elliot bricks that were made on what is now Waterport Road behind the town. And it was completed in 4.5 months by 14 workmen under the supervision of J.C. Leslie Tardrew, who was a local carpenter and builder and a keen cricketer. And the Victa Theatre was built for a contract price of £6,000. And when opened, it was described as commodious, cool and comfortable in the Victor Harbour Press. This is the Victor Harbour, the Victa Theatre as it was built in 1923, with a bus conveniently parked out the front because it was the local coach stop. And another view of the Victa Theatre on the right, taken during an 8-hour day procession, showing the Victor Harbour Volunteer Fire Brigade, ironically, as we'll find out. The Victa Theatre was licensed to seat 617, and it was designed for future expansion. By inserting a gallery, which was essentially a second level of seating, which could accommodate a further 300 people. And we can see on this drawing there are some very faint pencil lines indicating where that gallery could be inserted at a later date. This would have meant raising the roof and building up the front wall of the theatre quite substantially too. And if a gallery had been added to the Victa Theatre, it might have looked a little bit like this. This is a theatre in Renmark. So balcony across the front, seating above and seating below. Same architect as the Victa Theatre as well, Chris A. Smith. So, and here he is. Oops, where are we up to? There we go. All right. The Victa Theatre was designed by Christopher Arthur Smith, known professionally as Chris A. Smith. He was a Port Adelaide-born South Australian architect who, before the age of 30, which is younger than me, established himself as the state's leading architect for picture theatres and town halls in the heyday of cinema entertainment in the 20s, 30s and 40s. Over the course of his career between 1916 and 1942, he personally designed over 25 picture theatres and town halls across South Australia. Just a few examples. The Ideal Theatre at Kadina, 1921. Capitol Theatre at Peterborough, 1925. The Colonel Light Gardens Theatre, 1927. The Semaphore Ozone Theatre, 1929. The Hindmarsh Town Hall, 1936. Whoops, whoa, hello, we are really flying. Here we are, this is temperamental. The Roxy Theatre, Everard Park, 1937, one of my favourites. And the Capri Theatre at Goodwood, 1942. That's just a few, that's not even half, that's like a 12th of what he did. He was very, very busy. And at the time he designed the Victa Theatre, Chris Smith was 31. He just turned 31 a few days before. So he was very young. He also designed this theatre, which is the Melba Theatre at Dulwich, in Adelaide's inner eastern suburbs. It's now a rather nice homewares shop, which I encourage you to visit. And it's nearly identical to the original Victa Theatre. They were both built in the same year. The overall floor plan is the same, and a lot of the details are the same. So going and visiting the Melbourne Theatre can give you a really vivid sense of what this place would have looked like when it was first built. And, oh look, there they are together. Yep, see, you can see they're really quite similar. The same kind of parapet and a little porthole window, and the veranda. And incredibly, the Melbourne Theatre even has some of its original ceiling decoration, stenciling, intact still. So that's really quite interesting to see, quite rare. Chris Smith, as I said, born in Port Adelaide, left school age 14, apprenticed as a carpenter. In those days, if you wanted to be an architect, you were articled to an architecture firm, which was a bit like an apprenticeship, but it was very expensive. Only wealthy families could afford to have their sons articled. So Chris Smith's father was a waterside worker, working class sort of man, so the family couldn't afford to have Chris Smith articled. So instead, most likely Chris Smith was employed as a drafter for an architect and learned the profession on the job without any formal architectural training, and then went on to do all of these wonderful theatres. This is Chris Smith standing in the middle, and on the left is his older brother Thomas Edwin Smith. Now, as I mentioned, picture theatres or motion pictures were starting to become a thing in about 1907. Chris Smith and his brothers became interested in motion pictures. They started a film distribution business, and they screened one of the first films to be shown at the Port Adelaide Town Hall, possibly the first, in about 1909. The film projector was placed on a raised platform in the middle of the floor, and apparently the carbon arc light source placed such a strain on the Nile Street powerhouse that all of the street lights in Port Adelaide went out. But meanwhile, a few years earlier, and on the other side of the world, in December 1903, there was a deadly fire in the Iroquois Theatre in Chicago, Illinois. It happened during an afternoon matinee with around 2,000 people in the audience, standing room only. It's not entirely clear how the fire started, but most likely a stage light set fire to the curtains, quickly spread to several hundred canvas scenery drops suspended above the stage, all of which had been freshly painted with a turpentine-based paint, so they were highly flammable. And the burning scenery fell onto the stage, as burning scenery tends to do. When the cast and crew opened the doors at the back of the theatre was to escape, the rush of air entering the theatre pushed the fire up into the auditorium, right up to the ceiling at the back wall of the gallery. So that was bad, but worse, much worse, was the stampede. Many of what appeared to be exit doors were not actually real doors. They were painted onto the walls. And some of the real doors were locked too. So many people were crushed to death, which is really terrible. At least 602 people died, many of whom, of course, were women and children at this matinee performance. Now, the Iroquois Theatre was a stage theatre, not a picture theatre. However, it made governments around the world sit up and start to pay attention to the safety of theatres, and especially to the safety of picture theatres. And that's because, here's looking at you, kid, prior to the 1950s, motion picture film stock, that is the stuff on which a film is physically printed, was made of nitrocellulose and was known as nitrate film. Nitrate film was and is renowned for its detail and clarity, its high dynamic range and its colour fastness. Here we have a famous scene from Casablanca. This and all of the other films of the golden age of Hollywood were photographed and distributed on nitrate film stock. Unfortunately, nitrate is also renowned for its combustibility. It burns with a hot, intense flame, and once burning, it's very, very difficult to extinguish. The chemical reaction creates its own oxygen, so it will burn underwater, which is a problem if you're a firefighter. So the idea of large groups of people, thousands of people, and a flammable film stock, all in the same room as one another, with a source of ignition, which is the hot projection lamp, began to make governments around the world very nervous. In South Australia, this issue was addressed in legislation, the Places of Public Entertainment Act 1910 and 1913, with numerous regulations under the Act. I won't read the fine print. These regulations were actually very strict, even by today's standards. We're inclined to think of safety as kind of a modern thing, but South Australia had at one point what were considered to be the strictest safety regulations for theatres in the country. Smoking was forbidden in picture theatres, just about the only place you weren't allowed to smoke in that period of time. There had to be a certain number of exits. Oh, hello, we've gone way back. No, we haven't. It's all right, there we are. So there had to be a certain number of exits. So here at the Victa Theatre, you'll notice there are exit doors leading out onto the laneway on up there. So there are exit doors there and there. So the audience could escape quickly in an emergency. The projection apparatus, the projectors were housed in a reinforced concrete box with glass portholes on the front with shutters that could be closed off if there was a fire. This is the projection room at the Victa Theatre, sort of sitting up on the roof there, and you can see it's self-contained, and over the top of each projector is a steel hood leading to vents on the roof. They look a bit like kitchen ranges, actually, and it would have looked a bit like this one at Torrensville. You can sort of see those little hoodie things up there, and the idea was if there was a fire, the smoke would go up through those hoods outside. Infectious diseases were a major preoccupation of the time. So 1919 was the Spanish flu epidemic. One of the stipulations was that soft furnishings of theatres should be sprayed down once a week with a solution of formaldehyde. Just happens to be a Group 1 carcinogen, so perhaps not the greatest idea ever. For theatres over a certain number of seats, you had to have a fireman on duty. Projectionists had to be licensed, and it was an offence for any person under 21 years of age to act as a projectionist unsupervised. The 1913 Act appointed an inspector of places of public entertainment who was responsible for ensuring that theatres were good and did the right thing and complied with the Act. He was a sort of an official whipcracker, if you like. And the inaugural inspector was Chris Smith's older brother, Thomas Edwin Smith, who's this chap sitting over here. So the Act required your picture theatre to be licensed, so you had to apply for a licence, an annual licence to show pictures. And to get your licence, you submitted your plans to the inspector, and he would sign off on those drawings. And sometimes he would ask you to change your design on the basis of safety. Now, when the Griffins first considered building a theatre, being enterprising folk, their original plan was to build the picture theatre on top of the motor garage. Seemed like a pretty good idea at the time, and so they wrote to Tom Smith, the inspector, to get some official advice. And this is the letter. Dear Mr. Smith, we are thinking of going in for some improvements in regard to building a picture palace on top of the motor garage. We would esteem it a favour if you could run down one day. You could have 2.5 hours here and return by the same train, so that we may have the advantage of your experience on the matter which you have always so kindly given to us. The matter is somewhat urgent with us. If you can do this for us, we shall be very glad. Kind regards from boy and self, yours faithfully, D.H. Griffin. P.S. Next week if possible. And so Tom Smith, he picked up the phone very quickly, and he phoned D.H. Griffin, and he said, no, nice try. In his words, I informed him that it would be extremely dangerous to erect the theatre on top of a large motor garage, and advised him not to proceed with the erection of the building. The main reason, of course, is a motor garage contains a lot of highly flammable petrol and motor oil and all sorts of awful things that would really go up with a bang if they caught on fire. So in the end, the Griffins bought a second block of land. They built a new motor garage elsewhere. They knocked down the first one, and they built the Victa Theatre at ground level on the original block of land facing Ocean Street on this block, which in the end was a very, very sensible thing to do. But meanwhile, before the Victa Theatre had even opened, there's our little next week if possible. Before the Victa Theatre had even opened, competition had rolled into town. A community-owned cooperative company called National Pictures Limited, based in Prospect, decided they would open their own picture theatre in Victor Harbour. And guess who the architect was for the new picture theatre? It was Chris Smith. Oh, would you believe it? That's right. He'd already designed a picture theatre at Prospect for the National Pictures Limited. This is Chris Smith's drawing of the theatre that they ended up building in competition to the Griffins. It was built on Flinders Parade, facing Ocean Street. And here we have the completed Wonderview Deluxe Beach Theatre, as it was known. And behind it, just to give you context, that's the Whale Centre building there. And the railway line runs there, and that's actually a railway carriage. So it was right up against the railway line. Now, the Wonderview Theatre had two things the Victa Theatre didn't have. For one thing, it had upstairs gallery seating, like we sort of discussed before. This meant the owners could introduce a two-tiered ticket pricing system. Because the gallery seats upstairs were always more expensive than the downstairs seats. But more importantly, the Wonderview Theatre had a soda lounge. And a soda lounge, as some of you may remember, sometimes called a soda fountain, is a shop with a built-in bar that serves carbonated soft drinks, so obviously very popular in summertime. This is not the Wonderview Theatre, but it gives you an indication of what that soda lounge would have looked like. So not to be outdone, the Griffins very quickly decided that they would build their own soda lounge and cafe to compete with the one in the Wonderview. And they built the soda fountain on a mezzanine floor over a laneway down the side of the theatre with a lean-to roof. And it would have been kind of where this sort of row of seats is over here, sort of that side of the building. Sorry. Go back. There we are. So now, yes, I've lost my place. That's all right. Right, so this is an aerial view of Victor Harbour in 1928. The Victa Theatre is in green, with the little projection box sticking out the front on the roof, and in red is the lean-to roof of the soda fountain and cafe that they built next door. And it cost them another $4,000, so it was nothing to sneeze at. But it's a pretty simple corrugated iron structure, and it's actually going right up to the roof of the Victa Theatre next door. How they got approval for that, I don't know, but they did. This is another view of the... Oops. That may be missing, it's all right. Anyway, so there was a soda fountain and it was on there. Okay, so there was a rather cryptic comment about the building of the Victa Theatre published in the Southern Argus, and that was that the plans of the theatre were not strictly adhered to, and the building in consequence has been made much better in convenience and artistic taste than would otherwise have been the case. And I suspect this sort of slightly odd comment reflects the fact that the Griffin family were most likely a little bit salty over the fact that Chris Smith had gone and designed the competitions theatre, maybe behind their backs. Not only that, but they designed it with some features that were quite a bit better than what the Victa Theatre had, and made it in some ways a superior building. And as if two theatres in Victor Harbour wasn't enough, in 1926 an Adelaide-based company proposed building this large amusement palace at Victor Harbour. And guess who the architect was once again? It was Chris Smith. Can't get away from him. But unlike the others, this one never got off the ground, so maybe it was sort of a bridge too far. Anyway, after a while, after only a few years actually, the Griffin family began to tire of the exhibition business, and on the 24th of November 1926, which was the Victa Theatre's third birthday, they leased the Victa Theatre to the competition, National Pictures Limited, which meant National Pictures was now the operator of both picture theatres in Victor Harbour. So, meanwhile, we're going to pay a short visit to Semaphore in Adelaide's northwestern suburbs, another seaside holiday resort. And we're going back to April 1911, because it was on the 18th of April 1911 that Semaphore news agent Hugh McIntyre Waterman, who we see here in the middle with, oh no we don't, there we are, with the fist on his shoulder, screened his first film, which he projected onto the wall of a stable at the back of his business and family home on Semaphore Road. Hugh Waterman got together with four of his friends, Semaphore station master Chris Flaherty, grocers Les and Horry Warne, and electrician Jim Woods, They bought themselves a portable French-made Pathé film projector and a diesel generator. They called themselves the Ozone Picture Company and named for the sea breezes of Semaphore. And on the 24th of April 1911, they began screening films in the Semaphore Town Hall. They were extremely successful. They floated the business as a limited liability company called Ozone Amusements Limited, and in December 1913 they were able to open their first purpose-built picture theatre, the Ozone Theatre in Port Adelaide, which we see here, at a cost of £16,000, which is £10,000 more than the Victa Theatre cost, and seating 2,000 people. So to put that into perspective, this place only ever seated 999, so it's twice the size. Chris Flaherty's sister Annie was also involved in the business, first of all playing the piano to accompany silent films, and then after 1913 she ended up the conductor of the Port Ozone Theatre's house orchestra at this place. This was in the days when any suburban picture theatre that took itself half seriously had an orchestra. They expanded themselves rapidly. They opened a new theatre at Alberton in 1924, and Enfield in 1926. And while on holiday in Victor Harbour on the 31st of January 1928, Hugh Waterman announced that Ozone Theatres had acquired National Pictures Limited, one of its major competitors. Hugh Waterman's company now controlled 10 theatres, including both Victor Harbour picture theatres. This picture always gets me. Around the time the company was restructured and renamed Ozone Theatres Limited, and ultimately by the early 1940s had become the largest film exhibition chain in South Australia. At some point the business was also restructured into a family affair with Hugh Waterman and his numerous sons running the show. May or may not have been a hostile takeover, but in any case the Semaphore friends Chris and Annie Flaherty, Les and Horry Warne and Jim Woods were no longer in the picture, clearly. Horry Warne, who we see on the far right, he died in June 1928, only a few months after this announcement was made. He was actually found on a beach at Ceduna, taken to hospital, but he couldn't be revived. So a very sudden and unexpected end. And my understanding is there was a mental health component to that as well, so that was a very, very sad end for Horry. Meanwhile, Hugh Waterman announced that the Victa Theatre would soon be rebuilt with an upstairs gallery as originally planned, but this was not to be. And that's because in early 1929, the film exhibition industry was shaken to its very core by a disruptive new technology. Oh, look, it's the jazz singer. So the first films with an effective synchronised soundtrack, known as talking pictures or talkies, were screened in Adelaide in early 1929. Initial scepticism was replaced by acceptance as talkies rapidly displaced silent cinema. The film exchanges stopped importing silent films, so you couldn't get them anymore. Hundreds of musicians who had been employed to accompany silent films lost their jobs overnight. Ordinary South Australians heard American accents for the first time. Prior to 1929, you could see French or German films in South Australian theatres because all you had to do to make the German film or the French film into an English film was switch out the titles. After 1929, Hollywood films began to dominate film exhibition in the English-speaking world. The initial cost of wiring a theatre for sound was somewhere around £6,000, which is the same amount of money it cost to build this place in the first place, so it was pretty expensive. And then, as if that wasn't bad enough, the Great Wall Street crash happened on the 24th of October 1929, ushering in the Great Depression. So a lot of theatres closed. In Victor Harbour, Ozone Theatres chose to focus their energy here at the Victa Theatre, which was wired for sound with a Western electric system in November 1930. It cost $3,000. Price had come down a bit by then. And the first talkies screened here on the 25th of November 1930, the day after the theatre's 7th birthday. Poor old Wonderview, pretty building, but it was never as successful as the Victa Theatre, perhaps because it's a reasonable kind of walk from the commercial core of Victor Harbour. So it wasn't wired for sound. It ceased to be a theatre, and was used thereafter sort of sporadically as a dance hall, and for a while it was actually the local government high school. The typing pool was in the projection box as a way of sort of trying to keep the sound down, which is interesting. Can you believe? So, around this time, I'm going to have a glass of water. A man named Alan Woodard became manager of the Victa Theatre. He was born in Victor Harbour in 1911, 2 months premature, and he spent the first 2 months of his life in a shoebox, kept alive by the warmth of an open fire in his parents' kitchen. He had a speech impediment, and so the kids gave him a pretty hard time at school, as kids tend to do. He got out of there as soon as he could and apprenticed as a carpenter from the age of 15. Meanwhile, he scored a part-time job assisting in the projection box of the Victa Theatre. He became quite good friends with Laurie Waterman, one of the Waterman brothers who we saw earlier, and by age 19 he'd been promoted to assistant projectionist and qualified for his projectionist's licence. And on his 21st birthday he became manager and chief projectionist of the Victa Theatre, or at least he was now able to do that job legally, because I suspect he was actually doing that before without the proper approvals. Anyway, and then, well, shortly after midnight on the 15th of January 1934, a fire broke out in the soda lounge of the Victa Theatre. Various versions of the story as to how the fire started. Some people say it began next door on the premises of David Bell and Company's general store, with sparks from an incinerator, back in the days when people used to burn their garbage. Barbaric. But others say no, it began in the soda lounge. We don't really know. Nevertheless, the fire took hold in the soda lounge and soon spread to the theatre itself through those windows in the side of the theatre, which we saw before. The fire was observed by hundreds of people, many of whom jumped out of bed in their pyjamas to watch the blaze. And according to a newspaper report, it was one of the biggest fires in the history of Victor Harbour, and the street was lit up like day. This is a bizarre photograph. Don't look too closely. For a while it was feared the fire would spread to the town hall, which is behind us, but by 1:45 a.m. the Victor Harbour Volunteer Fire Brigade, who we see here, had the fire under control. I think this was for the 8 Hours Day march, where they're sort of in some questionable costumes, but anyway. In the end, the fire caused around £3,000 damage. This included water damage to the floor of the theatre, and the roof was reportedly left sagging, so some fairly serious structural damage to the roof. After the fire, Alan Woodard moved the film projectors and the sound equipment over the railway line to the Wonderview, and their screenings resumed while Ozone Theatres worked out basically what to do next. Now the Great Depression more or less pushed the pause button on the building industry in South Australia, as elsewhere. And so architects really didn't have a lot to do during that time. They'd done quite well during the 1920s, they'd made themselves a lot of money, and so many of them thought to themselves, well, there's nothing going on in Adelaide, might as well go and see the world, as you do. So one architect who travelled the world during the early 1930s was Frank Kenneth Milne, known professionally as F. Kenneth Milne. He was an Adelaide architect, born in 1885, so he was 48 years old in 1933 when he comes into our story. He's best remembered today for designing the Adelaide Oval scoreboard and inventing the incredible mechanism inside. It was all his original idea. Nothing like this existed before Ken Milne came along. So Ken and his wife, his lovely wife Hazel, sailed for Britain from Outer Harbour aboard the Orient liner Orontes on the 23rd of March 1933. The liner stopped off at a whole lot of lovely places on the way, Sri Lanka, Yemen, Naples, Toulon, and they arrived in London on the 26th of April. Oops, one of Ken's holiday snaps. Big Ben hidden by scaffolding. Here they are. Whoa, we really are speeding through this. Here we are, Ken and Hazel and friend around her shoulders. Anyway, I think it's a fox. Anyway, so Ken and Hazel spent nearly 5 months in Britain, travelling the full length of the country. thence to Norway, Sweden, Denmark and the Netherlands, back to London, and they arrived home on the 2nd of December 1933. So all told, just over 7 months abroad. And along the way, Ken Milne kept a wonderful journal of his travels, which is now held by the Architecture Museum at UniSA, which is where the proceeds from tonight's talk are going to. So on one hand, this trip was a holiday for Ken, but on the other hand, it was really a golden opportunity for Ken, the architect, to be able to see international architecture firsthand for the first time, because he'd never been overseas before. So a bit of professional development. Some of the places Ken Milne was particularly impressed by included the Whitehall Theatre in London, rather spectacular sort of French Art Deco interior with this chamfered proscenium over the stage. It's quite lovely. He visited the Lyric Theatre, which he thought was very modern. He visited the Cumberland Hotel. This was built in 1933, so it was brand new at the time Ken paid a visit. And even to modernise, it looks like something out of science fiction. And Milne was obviously quite impressed because he arranged to get his hands on a set of drawings for the hotel, a set of plans which he took home with him to Adelaide. And most interestingly for us, Milne visited the Hilversum Town Hall in the Netherlands, designed by Willem Dudok, a Dutch modernist architect, and completed in 1931. So modern architecture as we know it came out of Europe, and especially Germany and the Netherlands after the First World War. Modern architecture was a reaction to the horrors of the First World War, and it was about casting off the shackles of the past, starting again, looking towards the future, and embracing the possibilities of new materials, processes, and the precision made possible with industrial machine production. And the key ideas, I guess, underpinning the modern movement in architecture included things like the rejection of historical styles, so throwing off the past, and the rejection of decoration, which was considered to be dishonest because with decoration they believed you were disguising the true nature of things. Instead of decoration, modernist architects believed that it should be the natural properties of materials themselves that would adorn buildings. And Willem Dudok was a very important, very innovative early modern architect, and his work was widely acclaimed and imitated, and we'll find out a little bit about that later. So by the time Ken returned to Adelaide, the building industry had begun to recover. But by this time, the buildings that were being designed in Adelaide and South Australia were quite different visually from the buildings of the 1920s. Here we have a sort of typical 1920s Adelaide streetscape. The buildings are all designed in traditional styles based on ancient Greek, ancient Roman, Renaissance architecture, maybe a little bit of Gothic here and there as well, but broadly speaking, I think it's fair to say pretty decorative across the board. So by the sort of mid-1920s, buildings had begun to become a bit plainer, but they still had the classical columns often on the facade. So they were still traditional buildings at heart. So there were two new styles that emerged in the 1930s in South Australia, mid-1930s. The first is what we now call the Art Deco style, or what I call the Art Deco style. This is a new facade that was added to the front of the Sands McDougall building, stationer's shop on King William Street, Adelaide, completed in 1934, arguably the first Art Deco building in South Australia. And the key kind of characteristics of this style are lots of vertical lines, an exaggerated sense of height. It's sort of almost pretending to be a skyscraper. And most importantly, lots of stylized decoration. There we go. Lots of stylized decoration with a kind of geometric flavour to it. Lots of triangles and zigzags and things. So quite different from classical architecture, which had lots of scrolls and sort of flowing shapes. The second style, which became popular a little bit later, is a style that I call streamlining, or a streamlined style. Sometimes it's put under the umbrella of Art Deco, but there's actually a difference here. This is the Capri Theatre at Goodwood, and it's one of the best examples of the streamlined style in South Australia. The style is characterised by horizontal emphasis, sweeping curves, plain surfaces, and minimal decoration. We've gone where we are. If we compare a typical South Australian picture theatre of the 1920s, which is that one, with one of the early 1940s, which is that one, we can see just how much architecture had changed during that period of time, from very decorative, almost stupidly decorative, to very streamlined. And streamlining paved the way for the acceptance of modern architecture in the 50s and 60s. This is Adelaide High School, completed in 1951, which was very influenced by the work of Willem Dudok, incidentally, who we saw before in Amsterdam. So, when the time came to rebuild the Victa Theatre, instead of making good and putting things back the way they were, the Waterman family made a deliberate decision to start again. They hired architect Ken Milne, and they asked him to design what was effectively a new theatre on the site of the old. It was built over the course of 4 months by W.T. Wheatman, a builder based in Woodville. Ozone Theatres employed local labour wherever possible, and our friend Alan Woodard, then aged 23, is said to have supervised the construction in his capacity as manager of the theatre. There's actually a plaster light fitting in the foyer, and inside are all of the names of the people who worked on the building. The new theatre cost £15,000, and it opened on the 22nd of December 1934 as the Victor Harbour Ozone Theatre. This is the stage and the screen. It was the first South Australian picture theatre purpose-built to screen talking pictures, or talkies. Theatres that were purpose-built for screening talkies were quite different from theatres built for screening silent films. They needed to be a little bit different. They had to take acoustics into consideration, whereas silent films, as we sort of heard before, didn't really need to worry about that. And this is one of the reasons why Ozone Theatres Limited wanted to start again, more or less from scratch. So a number of differences between old and new. The first is the size. This is a comparison of the footprints of the two theatres. The new Ozone Theatre was much wider. This wall over here on this side is the original wall of the Victa Theatre. But on this side it's a brand new wall, built in 1934, and it's actually quite a bit further out. So the original wall of the Victa Theatre probably would have been right about that, where I'm pointing there, sort of down there. The new theatre is much longer. So the original theatre building ended, the whole building ended right about where the front row of seats are here, and then behind that you would have had the stage, and then there would have been a gap, and then there would have been the seats. So the seats might have been back where the projection box is here. So it's quite a fair way back. So quite a bit bigger. The ceiling of this auditorium, and in turn the roof, is also a fair bit higher than the original theatre in order to accommodate that gallery seating upstairs. So this is a long section, so if you sort of imagine the theatre's cut that way like a cake and we're looking in that direction inwards. So originally Cinema 2, where we are tonight, and Cinema 1 upstairs were all part of the same auditorium. And Cinema 1 was originally the gallery, or the dress circle as it was called, seating, with a balcony across the front. And there were wings on either side where you could also sit, and the remains of those wings are up on the walls on either side of us. There's one over there behind you, and there's one over there as well. So that's where you could sit. And so they're still there, but they're blocked off now. So the next sort of big difference is, this is great. This is a great photo. So there's the wings. You can sit in there, and there's the balcony, and we're way down here. Okay. I remember it like this. I remember coming here when I was 11 and seeing that like that, and I thought it was great. So the next kind of big difference is the style. So the Victa Cinema was designed in a streamlined style. It was the first picture theatre in South Australia designed in a streamlined style. Most likely the first building of any kind in South Australia designed in a streamlined style. So that fact alone makes it quite important in the history of South Australian architecture. Streamlining was a deliberately futuristic style. It was about emerging from the Depression with optimism for the future and confidence. In theatre architecture, it was especially about creating a sense of occasion, especially and almost a self-contained world that was a place apart from the ordinary everyday world. The idea was you'd step through the front doors of the theatre and you forgot about the troubles of everyday life. So some of the features of streamlined architecture that we see here include horizontal lines, with features like these bands across the facade that sort of go that way. Also the awning, which is a very long horizontal element. Contrasting vertical features. So we've got the fin on the facade and also this sort of arch that goes up over a contrasting vertical feature. Parallel lines, and we see this everywhere, all over the place. So the banded friezes which go around the auditorium, we see it in the multi-part chromed kick plates on the doors, which there we are. So those incredible things. Oh, I've lost my spot. And also the fluted black vitrolite in the foyer. So vitrolite was a glass material which could be various colours, and that colour actually went all the way through the material. So, and a lot of the shop fronts of the 1930s were black and green vitrolite with orange sort of stripes quite often. Circles, lots of circles, notably the foyer terrazzo work, the ticker box, the stair rails, and the sandblasted glass designs on some of the glazed doors. This was also one of the first buildings in South Australia to feature chrome-plated fittings. That was a fairly new process that had been invented in the 20s in the United States. Another feature of the style is architecturally integrated lighting, which means the light fittings are not just tacked on afterwards, they're all custom made for the theatre, and they're integrated into the whole. They're not just sort of afterthoughts. Incidentally, the ceilings and the wall decorations are all made from fibrous plaster, which is plaster of Paris reinforced with coconut fibre to give it a bit of tensile strength. And most houses of the 1930s would have fibrous plaster ceilings, so you may be familiar with those. As well as being employed for its sort of aesthetic connotations, streamlining was also preferred on acoustic grounds because reverberation could be controlled more easily. Flat surfaces could be given textured coatings to disperse echoes, so you're screening talking pictures, you want to reduce those echoes as much as possible. And it could also be less expensive because there was less decoration than those earlier picture theatres. It was also preferred on hygiene grounds because those smooth flat surfaces meant there were less places for dirt and dust to accumulate. Quite early on, film exhibitors began to realise that people were going to the pictures to socialise as much as to be entertained. In those days, a typical film program always began with God Save the King, and you'd all be expected to stand for that, followed by a newsreel, a serial or cartoon, and a feature. Intermission, which was a break in the program, offered an opportunity to socialise in the foyer or lounge, visit the soda fountain, or dash across the street to a confectioner. In the original Victa Theatre, hello, we've gone way ahead of ourselves again. We're jumping all over. I'm just going to see if I can find the little drawing. There, that's the one I want, but it's in the wrong spot. That's okay. So in the original Victa Theatre, the vestibule, which was up the front, the foyer, led straight into the auditorium. But here, the vestibule, which is number 1 on this plan, leads into a foyer, number 2, with a counter where you could order sweets or cool drinks. And there was also a side entrance, which is number 17, with a shop, number 16, which had a servery counter through there as well. So compared to the original theatre, so the original vestibule would have been just that room number 1. That's all it had, and straight into the auditorium. This has got really a lot of space to circulate and move around and gather and socialise and meet people. So there was quite a lot more space. When the Ozone Theatre opened, it was said that Ken Milne had drawn upon modern continental theatre practice, continental meaning European theatre practice, And we can see this by comparing the Victa Cinema to some of the places Ken Milne visited on his trip to Europe, but especially this one, the Hilversum Town Hall. So, Hilversum on the left, Victa on the right. These triangular balconies are similar, quite similar to the lights on the proscenium. It's a similar kind of idea going on. The windows on the front of the theatre are very similar to these windows on the town hall. Steel frame windows with a horizontal hood above and brick spandrels or panels of brick in between with white mortar as well, creating a sort of a long horizontal effect. Incidentally, these are half thickness bricks on the facade. They're called briquettes. Isn't that cute? Here on the facade of the Victa Cinema, they're all stacked in two courses, and this is one of the features of the Hilversum Town Hall that Milne sketched in his journal. Now, it's always difficult to say, well, this building influenced that building, especially when the architect is no longer around to ask. But it seems clear to me that there's a relationship going on, that this is something that Milne has seen, and then he's taken some of the ideas from that and used those ideas here. So really, this is one of the earliest examples of modern European architecture directly influencing something that was happening here in South Australia. So that makes the Victa Cinema quite significant in the history of South Australian architecture and design. As the first South Australian theatre purpose-built to screen talking pictures, and the first built in a streamlined style, it really set the pattern for all of the picture theatres that followed, including ones like the Regal Theatre at Kensington, which was designed a few years later in 1940, also designed by Ken Milne. And there were lots of others too. So a few other little interesting features which you may not be aware of sort of around the place. Prior to the introduction of air conditioning, which has been switching on and off all night as we've been listening, the ventilation of theatres was extremely important, especially in summer. As you know, hot air rises, and the Ozone Theatre had a perforated spine running down the centre of the ceiling to let the hot air up into the roof space. And on the roof, there were a whole lot of little ventilators that would let that air out into the open air. Again, it had openings down both sides of the auditorium, a bit like the original Victa Theatre, but here, instead of being windows, they're covered by steel louvered shutters that could be opened or closed. Okay, and on the front of those shutters on the inside, you can't see the shutters by the way because they're hidden, but here on the inside we have these perforated fibrous plastic grills to let the air through, but they will trap any stray light that manages to sneak in through the louvers. So quite clever. Keeping it dark, basically, because things have to be dark to show films. Some of you may have noticed these windows on the front of the Victa Theatre, but how many of you have looked through the windows onto Ocean Street? None of you, I bet, unless you've worked here. All right. So there's actually nothing behind those windows. It's a void. It's an empty space. It's roof space. So the purpose of those windows is ventilation. Originally, there were ventilation openings at the back of the auditorium, where they've sort of got the green rectangles. They've since been covered over, but those windows at the front of the building are actually letting air into that void space and then through into the theatre, so playing a role in ventilating the auditorium. And as you can see, this gets me, opening and closing those windows is actually quite a challenge and involves a fair bit of ladder climbing. I'm standing on when I took that photo, I'm standing on a sort of a catwalk. It looks like something out of Star Wars, and it's about 3 meters up from that floor below, so it's quite precarious. And at the rear of the theatre is a stage house, which is basically a big tin shed. This is what it kind of looks like inside. Would have been used to accommodate live performances, and originally the screen may have been mounted on wheels, so it could be rolled out of the way, like some of the town halls had. If we look at the outside of the stage house, you can see the shed part stands on a brick plinth or base, and at the very rear of the theatre are these openings in the bottom of the or openings or hatches in the brickwork down at ground level. And you may well wonder what these are for. So if we go down under the stage through this sort of ladder, on the bottom, downstairs, on the other side of those openings, there's a wooden chute and a kind of landing stage at the bottom. And so the film cases would be delivered to the back of the theatre. They'd open up these hatches in the walls, and they'd slide the film cases down the chute to get them into the theatre. So that's quite a clever little feature. And of course, my favourite artefact is the fire bucket, which you can see, it's up the front, it's just sitting down there, which was kept in the projection room and filled with sand in case of an electrical fire. So I quite like that. So the Ozone Theatre was licensed to seat 661 downstairs and 302 upstairs in the dress circle, a total of 963. And in 1937, the capacity was expanded to 999. The Ozone Theatre was particularly popular during sour weather over the holiday season, and during the 1940s, manager Howard Williamson was able to pack the theatre by phoning the local hotels and advising them that a special matinee had been organised. In 1949, along with other theatres throughout South Australia, the Victor Harbour Ozone Theatre received a new diathermal heating installation with these wonderful cast steel foot warmers attached to hot water pipes in the auditorium. So there's quite a few. They're still upstairs. You can still see them upstairs. I don't think there's any left downstairs. In 1951, the Waterman family sold their suburban and country picture theatres to Melbourne-based Hoyts Theatres Limited. And South Australia's Ozone Theatres became known as Hoyts Ozone Theatres. And here we have the Hoyts Ozone Theatre at Victor Harbour. Meanwhile, the arrival of television in the United States spurred the major Hollywood film studios to technological innovation. Basically, they latched onto anything and everything that could make cinema seem bigger and better than what the home audiences could get on TV to get people back into the cinemas. So this meant more films produced in colour. They played around with 3D for a while, and widescreen format films became the standard from the mid-1950s. One of those systems was known as CinemaScope, which used special lenses to squash the image, sort of squash it that way, onto the film when it was being photographed, and then another lens to stretch it back out again to the right size when it was being projected. Hoyts Ozone Theatres installed CinemaScope here in 1955, which meant a new widescreen. And during these alterations, the top and sides of the original proscenium were covered as the screen and curtains were brought forward. However, these original features remain. Oops, there they are. So this is part of the original proscenium, which is hidden behind the present-day screen and curtain. And there's talk of revealing these when the renovations happen in the near future. This is sort of the plaster grill that ran up above the screen. It's actually sort of up there somewhere. And the vertical fluting down the side. And the front of the original stage with its chrome-plated trim still exists as well underneath the current stage. So from 1954, traditional picture theatres began to experience competition from drive-in theatres. On the 11th of January 1959, the South Coast Motorview Drive-In at Port Elliot was opened by Roy Dennison and Gil Smith. And in September 1959, television was introduced into South Australia. We've gone back. There we go. And within 12 months, many suburban and country picture theatres had closed, and quite a few became supermarkets. The Waterman family, I think, saw this coming, and this was one of the reasons they sold up to Hoyts when they did, which was probably a wise move from their point of view. By April 1962, this theatre was only opened on Saturdays, and beginning in 1963, it was closed entirely for several months of the year. Hoyts closed their Victor Harbour Theatre on the 28th of March 1970, and it was sold to Roy Dennison for $25,000. Imagine that. Roy reopened for the 1970-71 Christmas school holidays as the Victa Theatre, Victor with an A on the end for the first time. As Roy also operated the South Coast Drive-In, and films were shuttled between the two venues for screening on the same night. In 1975, he extended the stage area, brought it forward to accommodate live shows, and spent $40,000 renovating the theatre. So the Keystone Angels, later the Angels, were formed in 1974, and the Little River Band was formed in February 1975, and here they are both performing at the Victa Theatre on this stage on the 29th of December 1975. Was anyone here for that? No? Oh, I'm sure you've missed out. I've missed out. I wasn't even born. So this is the Victa Theatre as it appeared in about 1990, maybe. Maybe a bit earlier. Looking fairly run down by this point and rather sad. After Dennison's retirement, it was purchased by Jeff Stock, who was a manager of the Victa Theatre previously under Roy Dennison. With the help of his family, Stock began restoring the theatre, repainting the exterior in July 1996, removing the drapes from the foyer, and reinstating original light fittings that had been removed and stored. He also changed the name from Victa Theatre to Victa Cinema, which is its current name. During the 1990s, film distributors favoured the multiplex, multi-screen cinemas, and so Jeff Stock rather reluctantly twinned the Victa Cinema in 1998, creating two cinemas out of one. This included a pair of walls in front of the dress circle balcony. We can sort of see them starting to be installed here, with an airspace in between to act as an acoustic buffer between the two theatres. But this work was done very carefully so that these changes could be reversed if it was ever desired. The new upstairs cinema, seating 286, opened on the 11th of September 1998, and the new downstairs cinema, seating 297, opened on the 6th of November 1998. This is the upstairs cinema with its original seating. In 2005, the Victa Cinema was purchased by David and Carol Stonnell. Major changes included reverse cycle air conditioning throughout and installation of 2K digital projectors from 2009, although Cinema 1 upstairs is still capable of screening 35mm. And in January 2016, the exterior was again repainted and the older signage replaced. And then in 2020, the Victa Cinema was purchased by the City of Victor Harbor, who have plans to integrate the Victa Cinema into a new arts and cultural centre designed by ARM Architecture. And ARM are a multi-award winning South Australian architecture firm, so the project is in very good hands. And then, in November 2022, the Victa Cinema was nominated to be assessed for possible listing in the South Australian Heritage Register. On the 25th of November 2022, the then chair of the South Australian Heritage Council, Mr Keith Conlon OAM, provisionally entered the Victa Cinema in the South Australian Heritage Register on the understanding that the place was highly likely to meet one or more of the 7 criteria for listing as a state heritage place. In the Heritage Assessment Report prepared for Heritage South Australia, the Victa Cinema, former Ozone Theatre, was found to meet no less than 4 of those criteria. I won't read the criteria, but under Criterion A, for demonstrating the evolution of motion pictures as a new form of mass entertainment in the 20th century, and in particular the role of cinema going in building community in regional South Australia during the interwar period between the wars. Sorry, that actually should be Criterion D. I have spelled that wrong. Anyway, under Criterion D, for being the first South Australian picture theatre purpose-built to screen talkies, and for establishing the pattern for all picture theatres that followed, thus making it an influential and pivotal example of an interwar picture theatre in South Australia. Under Criterion E, for being an early outstanding example of interwar streamlined architecture, articulating many of the key attributes of the style. And finally, under Criterion G, for being the only remaining intact picture theatre purpose-built by Ozone Theatres Limited, an innovative and influential family-owned South Australian company which grew to be the largest in South Australia during the first half of the 20th century. And for those who are really interested in some light bedtime reading, the Heritage Assessment Report, all 50 pages of it, is available for download from the Heritage South Australia website by clicking on that QR code. So that's there as well. So that's the history of the Victa Cinema. I think we'll open it up to some questions if anybody has any questions. I know Fran's got a question. Think fast, Fran. Yes, down the front. Maybe we'll just wait for the microphone. Thank you.
I'm talking about the country picture theatres. I'm just wondering, I grew up in Victoria, in Gippsland, and in the 50s I remember they had crying rooms at the back of the theatre. Did South Australia have any of those in their country theatres?
I'm not sure about country theatres. We certainly did in our suburban theatres, and I think the first may have been the Ozone Theatre that was at Glenelg, which is no longer there, but certainly Ozone theatres had crying rooms in pretty much all of their theatres. I'm not sure whether one was retrofitted later into this one, maybe, not sure. Interestingly, Ozone Theatre's major competitor, which was Star Theatres, they didn't have crying rooms. I don't know why, but it's quite an interest. I've often wondered why one company did and the other company didn't.
Yes, for those who don't know, the crying rooms were set up for mothers with babies, so
Correct.
the babies could go full out, and that was usually with a glass enclosure.
Yeah, that's right. And often churches too, in the post-war period, had crying rooms too, so the babies could cry as much as they wanted. Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
I've just got a little bit of a question. I was up on the screen a minute ago. I'm Gavin Stock.
Hello.
Jeff's son.
Yes.
The definition between the rebuild here and the one at Marrickville, or whatever, one's obviously being classified as a rebuild and one's obviously being classified as a new building.
So the reason for that is because at this one, essentially there was more demolished. Yeah. So like I said before, at this particular theatre, when I was doing the assessment, I think there might be something like 25% of the building left, of the original theatre left. So that wall that was the side wall, well, I'm going to be blinded by that. So the side wall kind of would have been there, and the back wall would have been there. So there's really only one wall left, and a bit of the sort of the footings and some of the walls at the front, maybe a little bit
behind the bio-box and around there, there's quite a bit of back left up there. Yeah.
So that might be there. Whereas Marrickville was more like retrofitting something into an existing shell, which was a lot more restrictive. Whereas here, Ken Milne had the freedom to, bring this out as far as he wanted and make these walls taper in and a whole lot of different things. So, strictly speaking, it's still a rebuild, but it's considered to be more purpose-built than the Marrickville, for example.
Because the other interesting fact that Alan Woodard was very heavily involved in rebuilding Princess at Marrickville too.
Yeah, correct.
Because he had his, I'm not 100% sure he was told of them, but he was in charge of the building works for the Waterman Brothers at that stage. But
that's right. Yeah, I don't think I mentioned in the talk, but he became an executive. He was on the board of Ozone Theatres as well. He's quite an interesting character.
Oh yeah, Alan lived to 101, 102, or whatever.
Yeah,
he actually had his 100th birthday at our house. So yeah.
Oh great.
No, he was a very interesting fellow, and his brother Jack, or whatever, he worked here too. So,
right. Okay. Yeah. Interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nice to meet you too, finally. I've got another one up the front. Here we go. You only get 3 wishes.
Okay. During the slideshow, there was a gentleman with quite a few of them, Horace something or other. I can't remember his name. Anyway, he was the manager of the Frolics.
Correct.
So could you enlighten us about that, please?
Okay. So in the early, sort of 1910, 1911, down at Semaphore, during the winter, Ozone Pictures ran a picture theatre, but during summer they had an open-air picture theatre on the Semaphore beach. And it was I guess it was what we might now call vaudeville, but in the time it was called a Pierrot show, and sometimes it was called the Frolics. And it was a stage theatre. It was on the beach. It sort of had a rudimentary stage and some simple sort of like a fence around it with some seating, and the sort of performances would have been pretty silly, kind of frolicking around, I suppose. That's why it was called the Frolics. would have been interesting to see that. Does that answer your question? Thank you. Thank you. Do we have any more questions?
Pop your hand up.
Oh, you get one more wish.
One more.
During the days when the boys left, or females left school at 15 and wanted to go into something, would there be a big line-up for the projectionists? Because if they were in there from 15 to 21, there wouldn't be that many theatres around, and they'd be waiting and waiting.
Yeah, I suppose so. I mean, in one way there were lots of theatres because every town had a theatre, but there was only one, and every theatre only had one projection box, and you'd only need 2 or 3 assistants probably. So I imagine that would be a fairly popular sort of job. I think from the reading I've done, it was a job that certain people sort of aspired to, or depending on their interests and so forth. Some people sort of, we all have things that we're sort of drawn to, and that was certainly a job that some boys would have liked. So yeah.
And in the 1920s, would it have been a luxury to go to the to Charlie Chaplin's theatre? The cost of it. I mean, I know the Depression came along after in the 40s or 30s, but yes, was it a luxury?
Cinema sort of began as a working class activity, and it took a while for cinema to be accepted as something that middle class and or wealthy people could go along to without sort of being embarrassed. So certainly I talked about the downstairs section, which was called the stalls, was the cheap seats, and the upstairs dress circle was the expensive seats, and part of that had to do with the idea of the rich people looking out down on top of the poor people. Ironically, the seats up in the dress circle are probably not as good as the seats down here because you're actually closer to the screen. And back in the days when it was the Ozone Theatre, if I could just find a picture of it, that screen would have actually been really quite small. I mean, compared to what we see today, that's a pretty small screen. And if you're sitting right way back at the back of the dress circle, which is the expensive seats, you're actually not getting as good a view as you would be down here. So, and I've forgotten the question.
That's okay, you answered it. Thank you very much. And I've done my 3, so I'll pass it on.
Good. Thank you. Any more questions? All right, well, I think we can leave it there. Thank you all for coming along and listening. Thank you.